Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today I have a special guest on, Dr. Phil Batterson. He has his PhD in exercise physiology and is an endurance optimization coach. So, going to talk all things around VO2 max and training around endurance, and obviously how to do that with the lens of hypertrophy and body composition side of things. So, Dr. Phil, I don't know if you go by Dr. Phil or what that looks like, but
You can just call me Phil. I got called out on one of my podcasts, funnily enough, because we were joking. I was like, it's Dr. Phil. And I'm not like the pompous, like you have to call me doctor or anything like that. It's just my tagline on Instagram at this point. So just call me Phil. And if you do approach me, on any Instagram or anything like that, you can just call me Phil.
Dr. Phil sounds kind of cool though, right? Like you think of the Dr. Phil guy, right? So it kind of rings.
Yeah.
But yeah, I understand that. But yeah, man, no, really looking forward to chatting with you today. And really appreciate you taking time out of your day to come on here. So, as with any new guest, what I like to do is just kind of briefly go over your background and kind of how you got to where you're at today.
Yeah. So I'll start with I've never really been a strength and hypertrophy sort of person, just because I've always resonated with a little bit more of like the endurance side of things. So I started track and field and cross country and stuff like in 8th grade, and turns out I was pretty good at it, which I think a lot of times, us as kids were looking for things that we're good at. I couldn't hit a baseball, I could barely, like do anything with football and stuff. So as much as I wanted to play sports, I really resonated when I finally was like, oh, wow, I'm actually like good at endurance sports. So it kind of started there. And then my journey to kind of endurance optimization in a sense, actually started with me going and being getting an undergrad degree in mechanical engineering at the University of Michigan. And during that time, I was, on the rowing team. I did some triathlon stuff, and I was really like all about kind of like efficiency optimization, like those sort of things. And that's what they kind of teach you in engineering school. Went down to Georgia, got my first job, absolutely hated it, had a sort of, quarter life crisis in a sense, like, what am I going to do the rest of my life? So I volunteered to coach as an assistant coach for a local high school. And it was a very, very world changing experience, because the team was so good, and the way that the coach led it, it was like something I was just like, yes, this is exactly what I would be looking for out of any sort of endurance coach, or cross country coach, running coach. So that changed my mindset. And I was like, I'm going to go back to school with the idea of learning all this knowledge, so then I can eventually become my best version of myself and help to disseminate that information and become a coach. So the next steps were go back to a community college, take like biology, organic chemistry that I like never even took, in high school or in undergrad. Did my master's degree at University of Colorado Springs, where I was fortunate enough to work on some projects that were like all about endurance performance and predictors of endurance performance. So I was very appreciative of VO2 Max before Peter Attia started becoming very appreciative of VO2 Max. So it really just warmed my heart when that started getting talked about, and especially in like the health and longevity space, because I've been trying to say it and I don't have a huge platform, so when, bigger people were saying it, I was like, yes, finally. So did my master's degree, got really interested in mitochondrial physiology, actually. So if, for those of you who aren't familiar, you might be familiar with the term, mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cell. But in all actuality, what the mitochondria are doing is they are controlling how much energy is being created, and especially in your muscle, regardless of the type of activity you're doing. So when you're doing your hypertrophy-based training, when you're doing your strength-based training, most of the energy that is being created to allow your muscles to continue to contract is coming from the use of oxygen at the mitochondria. So that really, really interested me during my master's degree. So then I went on to get a PhD, and the whole idea was I wanted to look at exercise and dietary interventions and how they affected your mitochondria, specifically the ones that are in your muscle, because your muscle is the most mitochondria dense tissue that you have other than your heart. So I looked at those adaptations and all of that. So if you've ever heard, podcasts with, Indigo San Milan or, other people like that who are talking about, like how to develop your mitochondria, that was like what I was kind of, like getting really well versed in during my PhD. And now I'm kind of living out in the country, in Central Oregon with my wife and our 3 dogs, cat, 2 horses. And we just trying to build my endurance training business, coaching people both online and locally, and using all of these principles that I've learned, from my education and my background to, like really help people optimize again their endurance, and just optimize their kind of like performance and health, like whatever they're trying to actually optimize at this point.
Yeah, and as I learn more and more about, improving your cardiovascular fitness and stuff like that is going to obviously really bleed into like everyday life and your performance and other things as well too, right? Which is really sparked my interest in it there, right? I was kind of telling you off air, like that's definitely been something that I've always like neglected it. I don't know, it's weird. It seems like I don't know if it's the way that I'm not sure what it is, but it seems like when you come from like a strength background or even just like getting personal training, like certification, stuff like that, like the aerobic fitness, things like it just, I don't know, kind of just gets brushed under, like not really talked about a lot for some reason.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where it's like, oh, you can just go walk.
Yeah.
Right. You can walk on a
Yeah.
treadmill. Like I just started going to a local gym. I haven't, like been going to a gym because I typically just train by myself. And it's really amazing to me. Like people are like, so focused on like their strength and hypertrophy, sort of thing. They're like, okay, I got 10 reps here. I'm going to rest 30 seconds and then I'm going to continue and I'm going to, like progress the weights and all of that. And then they just go, walk on the treadmill afterwards for 20 minutes. And you're like, I appreciate that you're trying to get your cardiovascular, sort of stimulus from that, but it goes much, much more beyond, just walking on the treadmill and, like being in your fat burning zone. I'm putting it in quotes for those of you who are listening and not watching on YouTube. But yeah, it's really interesting because I think like the strength and conditioning coaches or strength coaches, like personal trainers, the people who focus on kind of like the hypertrophy side of things, it actually would be really, really easy to layer on how to develop endurance exercise because it's very, very similar in terms of, like you're doing sets and reps and the higher the intensity you're going, the more rest you need. And, like, so when you do a sprint, 30 seconds as hard as you can, very much like when you do a 1 rep max, is like, okay, now you got to rest 3 to 5 minutes in order to repeat that. So if you're doing, like, so there's a lot of parallels within that. And I think it's just because it's easier to coach it, like people aren't, and I say easier to coach it, but it's not as focused on. When people come to a gym, they're like, yeah, I want to look better. Normally that's like change your diet, lift weights and build some muscle, and then go do a lot of like low level cardio in a sense to burn more calories, which we know is kind of just the scraping the surface at this point.
Well, it's like, I just kind of wonder where the cardio kind of got a bad rap. I would just wonder if it did start to maybe, and when I say a bad rap, like obviously you're like that, so it's not a bad, sorry.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah. Yeah.
Were you a team sport athlete growing up?
I did do team sports. Yep.
Okay. What did you do?
For like training?
Yeah. No. Like just what sports did you play?
Yeah. Baseball, hockey. Yeah. Baseball and hockey were like the two main ones.
Okay. So typically, how was cardiovascular viewed, like cardiovascular development viewed? There probably wasn't any, and B, it was probably your punishment, right?
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah, really
so there
was.
You go. I think that's like the majority of the answer. Is a lot of the times doing continuous, like doing reps or doing they're not called suicides anymore, but they're called touch and goes, like on the basketball court, until you're throwing up. Like there's a lot of negative connotations with that. And it's like, because I appreciate endurance activity does not mean that I enjoy doing like 4 minutes all out with 4 minutes rest. Right. It sucks. And it takes a lot of, like willpower, similarly to hypertrophy training. Like when you're doing, 8 to 12 reps at, like 2 reps from failure, like, especially like with a squat, for example, like if you're truly 2 reps from failure at the end of your set with squats, it sucks. So, again, parallels, right? But I think a lot of the times, I think that's kind of like people build that negative connotation, and then, maybe subconsciously it just kind of holds over.
No, that's actually a really good point you bring up, right? Because like I always think back to like I hated doing like workouts for sports because it was like just like you said, it was like suicides. It was just stuff that like just ended up just like not feeling good. I felt like it was just to like get you to like get your heart rate up and like feel like it was challenging, but it wasn't like necessarily doing anything. And then I also feel like too, like there's that. So that's a good point you bring up. But then also, when people like, from a body composition standpoint, weight loss, I feel like that's what people kind of associate that they need to do to like lose weight is this like super crazy amounts of cardio. And
Yeah.
that's what they rely on, right? And it's for that reason. And we know that it's like, obviously doing some of that can be beneficial, but if that is your only goal of like endurance training or your cardiovascular fitness, it's like that is gonna, I feel like, lead to that kind of negative perception of cardiovascular training and everything like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I think too, like within the literature, we started to see, like there was a paper, like really classic paper a long time ago that looked at kind of mediators of either muscle building or endurance building in a sense. And what they found is that the people who did a lot of cardiovascular activity actually shut down their ability to build muscle. They deactivated what is called mTOR. And I think that really, took effect and kind of holds over too, especially with the bodybuilding community. Is like, oh, well, if I do any cardio, say goodbye to your gains. And you're like, no, like those people, like, yes, from maybe like a cellular perspective, we're deactivating, muscle building or protein synthesis, but like it's acute. And if you do less, so if you're not doing hours and hours and hours, putting yourself into this massive caloric deficit, we find that you can actually have activation of both, and you can develop your cardiovascular system while also maintaining good levels of muscle protein synthesis. Obviously, what you're doing depends on, what your primary goals are. But I think that could have also, led to a lot of people being like, quote unquote, scared of cardio in a sense, like, oh, it's going to kill my gains. Right.
Yep. Yeah. It's like you said, it's the high amounts, and then again paired with like just the low energy intake, and again probably not managing their intensity whatsoever in the conditioning, and then on top of poor recovery in general. It's like, okay, yeah, all that stuff starts to stack up. It is gonna add up there, and you're probably not gonna be in a great spot to maintain or build muscle at that point either.
Yeah. Yeah. And you're going to feel tired too. So then then your strength workouts could potentially, not go as well as you want them. So, so it's all of those things, kind of layered on top of each other. And then I think also, like from like a personal training perspective, it's like the principles of endurance development aren't as appreciated, like you said, like within the courses that you've taken. It's like, yep, and then you just got to do your cardio, sort of thing, as opposed to it's actually as complicated, if not, or it's, I will say it's equally as complicated as strength training. If you want to develop hypertrophy, there's one thing. If you want to develop, like strength and power, that's another thing. Same thing with cardiovascular fitness. If you want to develop your VO2 max, you have to train one way. Whereas if you want to develop your second threshold to run a faster marathon, you have to train another way. And there's principles, of course, with all of that, but it's not as cut and dry as just like, yep, every day I'm just going to go do VO2 max intervals, and then I'm going to be, like a beast, like Lance Armstrong, or, something like that.
Yeah, you got to have some structure to it. And as you were saying that too, right? Like I like how you kind of broke it down that way of like, with strength and hypertrophy. It's like, yeah, you need to go and do the thing, but obviously to get specific to that, yeah, obviously you need to train in a certain way to do that versus just being random with it. But also like, I've been trying to make this point, for a lot of lifters too, is like you kind of hit on this earlier, like the programming and stuff. There's some similarities, and even with like the progressive overload side of things, right? I think we forget that you can progressively overload cardio and cardiovascular fitness in the same way as well too. And so and that was kind of for me too, that was a big kind of like light bulb moment as well. It's like, well, why would you not like do the same, have the same principle from a weight training perspective as you would? Again, I'm sure there's some things that are a little bit different, but again, you want to provide progressive overload in a cardiovascular fitness standpoint as well too.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. It's really a lot of those same principles apply. And I think like, that's where ultimately, I see a lot of weightlifters and stuff. And I'm just like, let's actually take a step back. So, like the weightlifters are saying, like strength, like grip strength, for example, is like one of the best predictors of all-cause mortality. And then the endurance people are saying, well, VO2 max is actually one of the best, indicators of all-cause mortality. And, I'm sitting here, I'm like, maybe we need to do both, for maximum longevity. And, it's like the endurance athletes, we don't want to lift very heavy. It's like, I've been there. It's hard. It's complicated. It's tough. Like, what do I do? That's another thing is like, it's like, well, what do I do with my actual like lifting routine? And then the strength athletes is like, it's the same thing. It's like, well, it's hard, like, what do I do? How do I progress it? Like even if you kind of generally understand, sort of like the progressive overload and like all of that, it's still like, well, do I start with the Norwegian 4x4 to develop my VO2 max? And the answer is absolutely not, because you're going to wreck yourself and it's going to suck. And I think it's really short-sighted for people to make blanket recommendations like that. Yeah. It'd be the same thing of like, oh yeah, if you've never strength trained before, just do like a 5x5. That could be like your thing. And a lot of people, don't get me wrong, they do really well with like a 5x5 sort of setup. But like, in all actuality, you could probably do something way, way easier and still get gains from it. And that's, so that's what I'm always thinking about is, yes, that's kind of what, we see maybe the optimal, according to like the research and stuff. But there's also been studies where people have increased their VO2 max doing 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, or 30 seconds on, 15 seconds off, or anywhere from, like 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off, 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off. It's like there's all these different flavors of cardiovascular development. And I really think, it's like, it's just an educational, sort of thing at this point. It's like, and that's what I aim to do. I recently made a post, and like one of the posts that always kind of go viral for me are like these, just single snapshots with like graphs. And one of them was like, okay, well, if you want to develop your VO2 max, your work rest ratio should be anywhere from 2-to-1 to 1-to-1. That's, that's kind of what you want to develop. However, like if we think about, kind of adaptations in general, just as like a continuum and a rubber band, if you're trying to develop your VO2 max, all you got to do is just pull up that rubber band kind of close to VO2 max, and you're still going to get benefits from it. So you could be a little bit under that intensity, or you could be way over that intensity and doing some sprint work. And at the end of the day, it really just comes down to, it's like, well, what do you like doing?
Yeah.
Like if you're the type of person who just likes, just sprinting all out, hauling ass, and then taking like 3.5 minutes break, you could probably get some good benefits, to your cardiovascular system just from doing that and repeating it like 4 times, for example.
Yeah.
Whereas if you hate doing sprints, then doing something that's a little bit easier in intensity, but longer with shorter rest could also probably help that. It's not going to be perfectly optimal for developing your VO2 max, but I always say, and I'm sure you've come across this, is like if the best, most optimal training plan, for longevity or health or whatever came out, there was a study that was like, yeah, you have to wake up at 4:30 in the morning and, swim in a cold pool. It has to be 55 degrees, and you have to swim, like 3,000 meters or something like that. This is completely made up, but if a study came out and said that that was the single best thing for longevity and health and wellness and all of that, I can guarantee you it would not be the best for me, because I hate waking up that early. Even though I have been waking up that early lately, I hate being cold and I hate swimming, so all of like the negative psychological factors that go into that as well probably beat out the benefits that you would get from the physiological side of things. So it's all about, especially for individuals who are already not seeking out cardio, for example, it's all about figuring out what you actually would like to do and what you can do consistently. That's always the thing that it starts with. Is I always say it starts with consistency, and then you can progress to some level of specificity. So if you want to be a good runner, you have to run. If you want to be a good cyclist, you have to bike. But if you just want good cardiovascular fitness, doesn't matter what you do. You could bike, you could run, you could do the stair stepper, you could do the elliptical, you could literally do anything. You can push a sled, you can pull a sled, whatever. But then you get to the specificity side of things. Oh, I want to be really good at hiking. Okay, so you should probably do the stair stepper or something if you want to get good at hiking. I want to be a good runner. I want to run a 5K. You probably should do some running. If you don't do running, it's going to be really hard to get good at it. And then you can get to the progressive overload side of things. But that's like kind of like the way I think about it. So yeah.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful. Yeah, I mean, you gotta stay consistent with it. Like if you're not, then it doesn't matter. And then I do like the specificity side of things, right? Like if you're not having anything specific that you just want to have better cardiovascular fitness, then you obviously have a ton of options. And then it really comes down to like, what do you enjoy and what's going to get you to stick to it, right? I mean, same thing with hypertrophy. It's like, do you like using more barbells? Do you like using more cables, machines? Like again, we can have that blend. You don't have to do one or the other. There now, if you want to go do a powerlifting competition, well, you probably are going to need to do some back squats if you want to do that. So I'm curious. So for you, you do some coaching now. Do you still do some research, or what does that kind of look like?
No, a lot of so I'm not associated with any universities or anything like that anymore. So a lot of what I'm doing is kind of taking I'm still using the research, and I think of kind of like endurance development as like a little bit of like a pyramid. or I guess we'll call it a funnel. We'll go the other way. So I think like where like my philosophy is like, okay, well, what are the studies saying on how, to develop your endurance, how to develop, your strength, your hypertrophy, like whatever. I start there. And then, we'll start with meta-analyses first, if we can find them. And then we'll kind of go down to peer-reviewed research. And then I start to look at, okay, well, anecdotally, like maybe what are the pros doing? What are the elite level athletes doing to kind of get like maybe an edge? Where's the what's the state of, like the industry? And then I kind of take it and say, okay, we're using all of this, and now let's apply it to an N of 1 experiment. So that's a weird way of saying like I'm not involved in research anymore, but I'm continually using it and iterating on it within, like training my athletes, training myself, trying to solve problems. Because ultimately, I think that's what, personal trainers, that's what coaches, that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to help solve problems for the individuals that we're working with. And even if you look at, like research, right, you'll have an average, and then you'll have, if you have like all the dots, you'll have a spread, right? You always have a standard deviation. So some people, maybe hyper responders to a Norwegian 4x4 method. Other people actually make it worse. So I like to take that sort of information, and that's how I keep up on the research. I will also work for a company called Moxie Monitor that makes a near infrared spectroscopy device. So essentially, we're just shining red light into your muscle, and it tells you how hard your muscle is working at any given point. So from that perspective, like I'm developing tools of how do we take, again, the research and then apply it to whether it's strength, endurance, those sort of things. So I'm not involved specifically in research anymore, but I'm still following along with the research and then using all of that and trying to like synthesize it and help people have better outcomes, for, whether it's strength training, endurance training, combination of the two.
With getting your PhD, and that makes sense, right? I mean, you're still staying up to date on all of it. You obviously use it in your coaching practice as well, too.
Yeah.
With your PhD, did you have to do some sort of like a dissertation or anything like that?
Oh,
Or
yeah.
did you have to do a stuff? Okay. And that was around mitochondria, you said was
Yeah. I can walk you through, kind of what I did. So I did a couple of studies, and I was involved in many more. My lab was really busy during my PhD. So the big one that I did was a human clinical trial study where we would get people in, essentially take them through 7 high intensity interval training days. So 30 seconds, or so it was a minute on, a minute off times 10. And we would do that every other day for 2 weeks. And what we were trying to measure is like, well, we already know that VO2 max should increase and power output should increase and all of this. But what we really wanted to know was, how do your mitochondria respond to this? Because the mitochondria are, again, the organelle that is responding to the exercise and pretty much where all of your energetics are kind of running through. And what we found was that just with those, just 1 minute on, 1 minute off, done every other day for 2 weeks, and this is in sedentary individuals, we showed that mitochondrial function, so how much oxygen your mitochondria could use, whether it was derived from fat, carbohydrates, or a combination of the two, increased by 30%. Which is pretty massive. So, so from that perspective, it's like, okay, well, that might be one of the reasons why this sort of training does lead to increases in VO2 max. So that was the first study that I did. And it was, again, really focused on, kind of like, how does exercise affect your mitochondria? And then I did a mouse study where we took female mice and we gave them like a normal sort of, like higher carbohydrate diet. And then we gave another group a high fat diet. And then we also took another group and we exercised them. So we had sedentary and exercised in individual mice. And then we had high fat and low fat fed mice. And what we were looking for is we wanted to see how female mice specifically respond to both of those sort of interventions. And what was really interesting to me was that the female mice respond, like, compared to male mice, because we another person in our lab did the male mice study. Females, because they just have better sort of hormonal milieu for more highly functional mitochondria, especially the mice, don't gain as much weight. The exercise wasn't quite as potent of a stimulus compared to the males, and the high fat diet wasn't quite as potent compared to the males. And, so it was just something that kind of stood out to me, is that it seems like at least female mice are a little bit more robust and protected, from the issues that we see with high fat diet induced obesity and type 2 diabetes. But on the flip side of things, also don't necessarily respond as well to the exercise that we're doing, at least the high intensity exercise. So maybe they needed a different dose. Maybe they needed, just something different. So yeah, so those are my two general studies that I did. And then again, the whole dissertation was all about, well, how do your mitochondria actually respond to diet and exercise interventions?
And with that, I mean, is there anything that, since you've done that in terms of like mitochondria, is there anything that you kind of like change your mind on or anything like that? Or like, I guess what would be maybe some good practices from that standpoint? And like with it is, I'm assuming there's not, other than like, I guess really is there anything that we can do especially for mitochondria, or is again, probably just a lot of the normal things that we would recommend to people?
It really is like the basics. If you want to have very highly functioning mitochondria, you don't need to take, like all these like crazy supplements and other things like that. Cause you're most likely you're probably not deficient in a lot of things. Cause if your mitochondria are messed up, you're pretty messed up. Exercise and eating appropriately. And the very interesting thing is that, and this is why people can be successful on a high fat diet, a high carbohydrate diet, and really anything in between. Your mitochondria respond to what you're eating. So if you're eating a lot of fat within your diet, your mitochondria get really, really good at oxidizing fat. And if you're eating a lot of carbohydrates, your mitochondria get really, really good at burning carbohydrates. So the bottom line is, as long as you're not overeating, then your mitochondria are highly, highly adaptable to the food that's coming in and going out. Which I think is then promising for people, because just like we talked about, like exercise, you should pick, kind of what you want to do and what resonates with you the most. Kind of with diets is like, well, what can you stick with? What resonates the most with you? Like, like what are the things that are going to allow you to be successful on eating in a caloric deficit? So that's kind of like, that's always where I start is, it's like your mitochondria are going to respond with that. And then exercise is kind of the icing on the cake. And here's another big thing. High intensity exercise is really the thing that is going to allow you to get the most improvements in your mitochondria as quickly as possible. There's a lot of sentiment about, like zone 2 training. I don't know if you've heard about zone 2 training, but it's like the sentiment behind it is like, oh, well, zone 2 training is going to help improve your mitochondrial function. It's going to grow your mitochondria, all of that. During my PhD, this meta-analysis and review wasn't out yet, but I started to kind of like gather. I was like, it's probably zone 2 training for most people. You're probably not doing enough of it, because you need probably like 8 to 10 hours a week, 8 to 10 hours a week of zone 2 cardiovascular training, which is a lot. That's like, like a 1/4 time job to get, to see these improvements in mitochondrial, size and function. And so that's not very realistic for people. But then on the flip side of things, if you do 1 minute on, 1 minute off for, every other day for 10 times, then you can improve your mitochondria by 30%. So from a time efficiency perspective, I think a little bit of the zone 2 stuff is a little bit overblown, just because of the populations that were looked at within the study, or within like kind of the studies, and then anecdotally and how they're talked about. So the bottom line is you probably need to do some low level activity, maybe not to develop your mitochondria, but more for like a nutrient turnover perspective, because when you are exercising, like walking and doing those sort of things, you get a lot of breakdown and movement of things like fats and carbohydrates and all of that. But you also need the high intensity stuff, so this is something I've tried to talk to like my parents, who are getting a little bit older, a little bit older, like 75, 65 now. Like, you need to lift heavy weights, and if you can, and you need to do high intensity stuff. Because if you don't, then, that's like the single best recipe for losing your functionality from both a cardiovascular perspective and a strength perspective. And that's kind of what we're battling, with like the whole longevity, sort of thing is, well, I want to be as functional as possible. Like, if you've ever seen somebody who's super detrained, my grandma is actually a very good example of this. For the last like 10 years of her life, she, was very sedentary. And, every time we would see her, it would be harder and harder for her to walk upstairs. So essentially, she let herself, like, her VO2 max got so low that like she couldn't walk upstairs without doing a VO2 max test. So you never want it to get to that point of like, oh, my daily activities are eliciting my VO2 max, because then you're going to be really miserable. If you think like doing VO2 max workouts on the treadmill are miserable, think about like every single time you go to like stand up from the couch, or, stand up from the toilet, or, do anything, walk up some stairs, you're reaching VO2 max. That seems like a pretty miserable life to me.
Well, and just like, again, like you said, I mean, if you're always doing VO2 max tests, you're also, again, it's like from a recovery standpoint, it's like that's also taking a lot of, and that just continues to add up.
It's just like, downward too. Spiral of just awful. And then you feel like shit, and then it's just bad.
So For you, I mean, what before we dive into the VO2 Max stuff, 'cause again, I really want to, yeah, dive into, what it is, stuff like that. But with your training and what you do, do you incorporate any strength training, and then what are you kind of working on specifically right now?
Yeah. So I've been battling a lot of like back issues, hip issues, ankle issues, like those sort of things, just from kind of general overuse, throughout the years. And but I've always appreciated, like strength training. So at one point, like during my master's, for example, I had gotten my trap bar deadlift up to close to 400, at 160 pounds. So I was like, like in those sort of times were when I was feeling the best. But then I started doing CrossFit, and combining the super heavy weightlifting with the dynamic movements of like bar muscle ups and other things like that was just a huge recipe for disasters. Pretty promptly herniated a disc, and did that multiple times, to the point where it was like could barely walk the next day. Found out I had a torn hip labrum, which could have been associated with that, or like, other things just from overuse. So I've been kind of battling back, trying to get that better because I want to start to lift heavier things again. I have been doing really heavy sled pushes lately. So 400 to 450 pounds. And that seems to be okay from a tolerance perspective for, like my back and all of that. But yeah, that's like kind of my goal. I'm kind of in like the rehab state right now, with the idea that I want to just continue to build like my resilience and my endurance and all of that sort of stuff. And maybe do like a 50K in May of next year. But if that doesn't happen, then I'll just do shorter stuff, because shorter stuff is a little bit, more fun. It's a little bit easier to train for. So last year, my big A race was like 2.5 miles and 2,500 feet of gain, which is like crazy uphill, but it's super that's like my bread and butter in terms of, it's like I feel strong because I get to like train kind of like the uphill nature of things, and it's kind of what my body can tolerate at this point. But yeah, my goal after I do, kind of like all this like rehab, prehab sort of stuff is to start, then implementing, probably heavy quarter squats would be a really, really big one. That would be effective for that. Like I said, I really like the sled push. It's like, it's super fun, and I can move a lot of weight with it. And I think it's highly translatable to running as well. And I would love to get back to, like heavy hex bar deadlifts too, and then slowly build up my squats and, like all of that. But yeah, it's mainly lower body sort of focused. And then, like really, because the research kind of says that you will gain the most efficiency with your running if you're doing lower body, heavy and powerful movements. That's kind of how I've been implementing it into my training, or at least that's where I want it to be.
Versus, I feel like a lot of correct me if I'm wrong here, but like a lot of people, again, with an endurance background, it seems like they, like you said, that don't really like the heavy lifting, and so they end up kind of going for, I feel like, that like 10 to 20 rep range, like higher like rep range, and it's like it's probably not going to be the greatest for obviously from like a fatigue management standpoint, but then also like you're just not developing that kind of high end like strength on the other side that's probably going to transition over a lot better.
Yeah, you're doing the same thing you do every single day, which is like repeated movements with lightweight, right? So that's kind of what I tell people, and that's one of the mechanisms that I think is explaining why it's so beneficial to do really heavy, really powerful strength movements for runners, and cyclists too. Cyclists, we see if you do heavy strength work, and not one of the funniest things is that like some cyclists will call strength work just putting their bike in really, really low gear and then just riding at a really low cadence. And I'm like, guys, that's the exact same thing as just riding your bike, you're just making it harder on yourself. And you're not going to go out and you're not going to actually race at 40 RPMs. So you might as well reduce that even more, go and do some squat press or leg press, like heavy stuff, like as heavy as you can get it, because that's really what has been shown in the literature to actually like be beneficial. But yeah, I think as with everybody, we kind of gravitate towards the things that we know and we like, kind of going back to the beginning of our conversation. So that's where I think like a lot of runners and a lot of endurance athletes are like, yep, I just got to do like easy stuff. And then there's the big myth, right? That, if runners touch heavy weights, they're going to get big. Yeah. And it's just so laughable to me, because like, how long have you been working on strength and hypertrophy? Like I've seen like some of your videos and stuff. I'm like, holy shit, like Jeff's like jacked. but like, how long did it take you to get to that point?
So I'm 34. 34 now, and I've been lifting consistently since I was like 17 or 18.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
It's like, it's like, even when I was lifting my most, like the heaviest I was still like 165 up to maybe 170. And like, I had some muscle, but I wasn't like, I wasn't like you. I wasn't like anybody who focuses, specifically on hypertrophy. And that's the thing is like, again, people get scared of it because they've heard, like I'm just going to get huge. I'm going to look like a sprinter. And you're like guys, it doesn't have, if it happened that easily, like we would have a lot more people in, with six packs, who are jacked. I guess like, Nick Bear is kind of, like, kind of spitting in the face of that. But also if you look at where he was when he was bodybuilding to where he is now, he's lost a significant amount of muscle masses, like too. So even though he's still jacked, like,
and even somebody like him too, right? Like he's popular on social media, for good reason. Like, but I feel like those people end up like they're more of the exception than they are the actual rule to things, right? Where it's like those people those are gonna be the people that are gonna get the most exposure on social media. And it's like I do feel like, again, I know he probably works super hard, but he probably has some sort of genetic makeup that's going to make it easier for him to maintain the amount of muscle that he has. And again, like I said, he probably also nails his like training, nutrition, recovery, and all that. And that's also going to help as well too. So
yeah, that's exactly what it is. And then, it's like, but if you ever go to like go to a gym, go to, just like a local 5K or something like that, there is like every single body type, all over the place. And 99.9% of them do not look like, a Nick Bear. Or another guy who comes to mind is Hunter McIntyre. He's now a High Rocks athlete, but he is like he very incredible endurance athlete, and typically weighs around like 180 to 200 pounds and can run like 5-10 minute miles like it's nothing. But he's also the type of guy who has everything dialed in. He's figured out what works for him. He's like been doing it for 20 plus years, and he is just absolutely relentless. Like, he shows like his workouts and stuff and what he recovers from and all of that. And you're just like, yeah, it's like you got something, whether it's like psychologically genetic, better, and physically genetically better. It's like I don't think my body frame could hold on to, like the heaviest I ever was 185 pounds in undergrad when I was drinking a lot of beer and eating Chipotle every single night. And, even after that, it was like, I got out of college and I stopped, having bad habits like that. And I was immediately back down to like 165, so it's really, really hard. And, like just like all the listeners out there, I'm sure, who have been on hypertrophy journey and stuff, it like if you gain half a pound of muscle mass, that's a massive, massive win. And it's really, really hard to come by.
And when you start, look, you never have as much muscle as you want to have. There's always more that you want to have, especially if that's what your focus is as well too. And I'm sure with endurance training, it's probably the same thing, right? You never are as good of an endurance athlete as you want to be. You always want to be a little bit better. Cool, man. Well, let's switch to VO2 Max. So again, we've kind of been referencing this a lot throughout. And again, I feel like this is now, you know the importance of it, but I also feel like, again, there's probably some people that maybe don't speak about it in the right way, and then now some people are like, oh, it's overrated, whatever it may be. So I'm just curious to hear from you, like, well, I guess what is VO2 Max, and then we'll kind of just go from there in terms of like what it can tell us and things like that.
Yeah. So VO2 Max, just like from a physiological perspective, is how much oxygen your body can take from the environment, load onto your blood, and your blood is what carries the oxygen, and then deliver it to your muscles, and then use it at the muscle to create energy during exercise. So VO2 max is really the maximal amount. So that only occurs when you do very high, like pretty high intensity exercise for extended periods of time. So that's, what it is. What it essentially is telling us is your engine, is your aerobic engine, a V4, a V6, a V8, a V10, a V12. And for most of us, we're probably a V4, V6, the V8, V10, V12s. Those are the people who, probably have been training, endurance stuff for quite a long time. The 12s are like very, very, very rare. And those are like the most elite level endurance athletes, on the planet. And what I tell people is like, because then the question is like, well, how do I test it? Right. Or should I test it? And your Garmin watch, your Apple Watch will give you an estimate of what your VO2 max is, but it's not actually measuring how much oxygen you're consuming. So if you really want to know what your VO2 max is, you would go into a lab. And if you've ever seen like Rocky 3 with like the Russian training scene where he's like in that like white, sort of white walled lab and stuff, it's not quite, like that strict, but it looks kind of like that. You'll have a mask put on you that is essentially measuring how much air you're moving and then how much oxygen and how much CO2 is within that air. So when it goes in, there's a certain amount of oxygen. When it comes out, there's a certain amount of oxygen. And you'll go through an exercise test that starts really, really easy, and it gets progressively harder until you fail. You say like, I'm done. You tap out. I've never seen anybody like get to a point where they just like, it's always they tap out. Like you always fail a VO2 max test because it will just keep getting harder until you have to stop. And at the end of that is where you really figure out what your VO2 max is. So that's what the test would actually look like. What Garmin and what Apple Watch are trying to do is they're trying to get an idea of what your estimated VO2 max is based on how well you perform like a running or a cycling activity. So I don't know the exact like calculations that go into this, but I think Garmin is something along the lines of you have to be exercising for at least 20 minutes above 75% of your estimated max heart rate. And then they can give you an idea of what your VO2 max is. Apple's a little bit different. But at the end of the day, that's kind of the idea. It's like, well, what's your top end, sort of aerobic speed, aerobic power that you could maintain for maybe 5 to 10 minutes. So it's a good proxy for it. It's measuring performance and all that, but is definitely not measuring VO2 max. And there's studies out there that show differences in terms of like how off they can be with people. The people who tend to have the most similar VO2 maxes are the ones that are continuously like exercising pretty hard. And then they go into the lab and they're like, well, my Garmin says 54. And then like the VO2 max test said 54. It's like, yeah, it's like, cause you're doing the test to how it should be, but then other people, it can be 10, 15, 20 points off. So just be aware of that.
Does that tend to overestimate the VO2 max, like on those Apple Watches? And
no,
stuff
it tends
like
to oh, that's a good question. It obviously it depends on the person, but it probably tends to underestimate because I think a lot of people, especially like if we're talking to people who don't really like to go super hard, who like use cardio as a little bit more punishment and stuff like that, you're probably not running very hard for very long. So it would underestimate what your VO2 max is, which then that's great. Like surprise, you're 10 points higher or something along those lines. But if you really want to know, then you have to go and get it measured somewhere. That's the bottom line. Or you have to do the test to the specifications of whatever device you're using is, and you have to repeat that over and over again just to see if you're actually changing.
So for you with this, I know you do testing. Do you do this with all your clients as well too? And again, like let's say somebody, I guess how do you do it? Because I think you have stuff at home that can actually take the test, right? Like you can do it at home as well too, which is super helpful. But let's say, how do you do that with your clients, and what does that kind of process look like?
Yeah, if I have a local athlete that I'm working with, I have them come up and then we do the test either on a bike or a treadmill, whatever their primary sport is. And the devices that I use to actually measure that, I use something called a VO2 Master. It's a portable, just sits on your face. It literally just looks like there's a blue mask with like a device plugged into it, and then it relays all the data to my iPad, which is super nice because then you don't have to deal with tubes and other things like that. Use a heart rate monitor, and then I use those Moxie monitors that I was kind of talking about as well, just to get a little bit more granular to see not what VO2 max is, but where your zone 2 training heart rate is, and then where your like second threshold heart rate is as well, because that builds out all of your training zones. If an athlete is not working with me locally, I will try to get them to go into a lab if they can afford it, and if they can find a reputable lab that will actually do tests appropriately, because sometimes, I'll talk to, whoever's running the test and they won't be willing to customize the protocol, or their protocol is too short, or, something along those lines. And then I say, yeah, we're not going to go with them because they're not going to get us good data. If that's the case, if we can't get good data, then we'll do some we'll do some like field tests. And, you know, for anybody out there, like essentially what you could do if you wanted to just replicate a VO2 max test is, and this probably would work pretty well for like your Garmin and your Apple devices. I can't promise that they'll work, but just, you know, like if treadmill, we'll use treadmill as an example. If you like running, start really, really low exercise intensity, you know, like the first speed that like allows you to jog. And then do that for a minute. And then every minute after that, just increase like 0.3 to 0.5 miles an hour and just keep doing that until either if you max out the treadmill speed, then you have to start going up an incline. So then start going up an incline. But most likely people aren't going to get to that point. So once you fail, you know, that would essentially be like your VO2 max speed. And then you'd be able to go back and you'd be able to, you know, like do your intervals and stuff if you're interested in improving your VO2 max. I would also recommend like wearing a heart rate monitor with that too, just because that will give you a little bit more insight to, well, how high can my heart rate go? And then where should I target how hard I need to work during my VO2 max intervals in order to elicit change, right? Because if you're going too easy, then you probably aren't going to be improving VO2 max too much.
I know Dr. Mike T. Nelson, he kind of talks about like a couple of them, the field tests are like the Cooper run test. He likes to do the 2K row as well too. I mean, what are your thoughts on those? Are those things that you can get away with? Like, are those solid field tests as well too? If somebody wants to test this, or
those are really good. Those are like validated, you know, sort of like VO2 max estimates, and it's all VO2 max estimate at that point because you're not truly measuring VO2 max, but essentially like your ability to do some sort of activity for anywhere from 6 to 12 minutes is kind of a really, really good proxy for what your VO2 max is. So again, if you want to do a 2K row on the rower, it's probably pretty good. If you wanted to do, I think, is the Cooper run test, is that 2 miles or is it 12 minutes?
I think it's 12 minutes.
Okay. Yeah. So that's like run hard for 12 minutes. I would also say if you are a runner, just go run a mile at the track, like, you know, so 4 laps around the track, and then go to a website called, I think it's just called like VO calculator, or just type in VO calculator. And what that does is that allows you to type in your distance, your time, and then it gives you again a proxy of like what your VO2 max is. So super easy, but at the end of the day, like VO2 max isn't the end all be all. It's, you know, so the sentiment or the comment that you made is that, oh yeah, you know, people are now saying VO2 max is overrated. And it's like, I understand that idea. I think it's coming from, you know, as soon as an outcome variable becomes the target variable, it no longer explains like all the stuff that we want it to explain, right? Because you could have somebody who just does VO2 max work as long as they can, but doesn't do any strength training, doesn't live a healthy lifestyle, like all of that. And they're not going to get they're not going to reap all of the longevity benefits of that. It's the same thing with like grip strength. Grip strength is another, you know, like proxy for longevity. And it's like, okay, well, if I just did like the gripper, you know, like if I just got really, really good at grip strength, that does not mean from the rest of me, you know, it's like I could be chain smoking cigarettes and have an awful like VO2 max or something. So as soon as like I said, as soon as an outcome variable becomes now the target variable, it no longer really predicts what we want it to predict. So just keep that in mind. But if you're not doing anything high intensity, you will definitely improve your health and longevity by doing stuff that is high intensity.
Yeah. And so, I mean, when we take this from like a kind of a lifter type lens, you know, for somebody like that, I mean, do you see the benefit of them still testing their VO2 max to kind of see where that's at? Or there may be some things that they can look out for if it's like, again, they don't have access to what you have. Like, yeah, maybe fill the audience in on that a little bit.
Yeah, I would say it's always nice. It's always good to kind of test this, just because if you are the lowest 25%, you are at a much, much, much higher risk of cardiovascular disease, other things like that. So getting it tested, doing a Cooper run test, doing, you know, like a 5-minute all out bike test, and then trying to, you know, convert that to what your VO2 max could be. And then looking at where those numbers are comparatively is really, really useful. For men, I believe anything over 50, you've essentially maximized your benefits of, you know, just from like a health and longevity perspective. For women, I believe it's a little bit lower than that, maybe like 45. Those aren't exact numbers, but it's pretty close. So 45 to 50, and that's milliliters per kilogram per minute. So most of the time, that's what VO2 max is going to be reported in anyways. So test your number, like whatever your watch says. If your Apple Watch says your VO2 max, like your VO2 max is like 30, for example, don't believe that until you do some sort of test that actually can be registered well for the Apple Watch. There's people that are very health minded that come to me every once in a while, and they're like, dude, my VO2 max has fallen 20% in the last 2 weeks. Like, did you change your exercise patterns? Like, yeah, well, I stopped biking. It's like, yeah, that's why. Because now, your Apple Watch is no longer registering that you're still training, because they're like training for tennis or doing something like that. So it's no longer registering in the algorithm. So your VO2 max actually isn't falling because you're still training and you're still staying up to date with stuff. But if you're really interested in figuring it out, do it to the specifications of whatever the watch that you're using, or do a Cooper test, or, any of these proxies for VO2 max. And then if it's low, and one of the ways to know if your cardiovascular, your cardio is low or not, if you're gassed after doing like a set of squats or, something along those lines, and it's really hard for you to recover, it's probably about time to do some cardiovascular training. And if your VO2 max is low, is kind of on that low end, I would say really anything like below 35 in a sense, probably also could benefit from some of that training. And the good news is you only have to do it really like once a week. You don't have to go and you don't have to do, like what the research does where they do 3 times a week, 4 times a week, like other crazy things like that.
The Hickson protocol.
Dude, the Hickson protocol is crazy. I didn't even know that it was a thing until very recently. And it's like that seems miserable. And I don't know how people do it. But that's like, what is it? It's like 4 minutes. Is it 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off, like times 8?
I can't remember what they did exactly, but I know it was insane the amount of volume they did and intensity.
Yeah. Yeah. So like what we were talking about earlier is like, if you've never done that before, don't start with the Hickson protocol, because that's probably like the maximal thing that you could do to try to elicit changes in your VO2 max. Start with kind of the protocol I was talking about. Do 1 minute on, 1 minute off. The 1 minute should be as high as you can maintain, that you can then do that 10 times in a row. So that's the idea. And it's a 1-to-1 work rest ratio. So if 1 minute on, 1 minute off doesn't appeal to you, you could do 30 seconds on, 30 seconds off, really any iteration in between, that and 4 minutes on, 4 minutes off. But the at the end of the day, if you're just coming to this, 1 minute on, 1 minute off times 10, start a little conservative on the first few reps, because if you go out too fast, you're going to be not loving it. And it's always easier to go a little bit harder at the end than it is to, kind of just like hold on for dear life. And then, from like just an internal or like a heart rate perspective, the typical recommendation is like, you should be hitting 90% of your max heart rate. So if you've done, sort of like any sort of, field test, or what I described as like that step test, you'll know what your max heart rate is. And then I would honestly aim for like 95 to 90% of your max heart rate. And it's definitely not going to get there in the first rep. So don't try to get it there in the first rep, or else you're, again, going to be really suffering. Probably after the first 5 reps, it should be starting to creep up there. And do that once a week for 4 to 6 weeks. Repeat your field test. See if your performance got better. If your performance got better, most likely your VO2 max got better, if you can't measure it. But if you're measuring it with your watch, then you should see, those improvements over time. Because ultimately that's what we're looking for, right? Is like, or at least that's what I'm looking for in terms of my coaching, is I want performance gains, and pulling the physiological levers, like increasing VO2 max, increasing second threshold, increasing zone 2 durability, whatever, like other variable you want to look at, is all well and good. But if that doesn't translate then to increases in performance, it's like, okay, well, how functional are you getting? Right. Are you actually getting more functional? Because if you did like a squat protocol where you're like, yeah, I'm trying to and then you did like a 1 rep max squat, and your 1 rep max didn't go up, and that was your key output variable, you'd be like, well, that was a waste of time. So you really want to make sure that it's like you have the performance variables there too, and like what you want to get out of it.
So again, like you're saying, I'm assuming depending on where you're at, right? Like once a week, like especially for like lifters, again, if you're like kind of those numbers you were given, where does like longer duration type stuff fit in? I know we talked about zone 2, about how like, okay, again, if you're not training a ton, it's like you're probably not going to get a lot of benefit from that. You probably want to do something a little bit higher intensity. But is there any room for, say, like a for lifter, like 20, 30 minutes, stuff like that into their program? Like what kind of, is that going to help build their VO2 max as well too?
Most likely no, because it's like generally done at such a low intensity. And we have to think about like your body is going to adapt to the specific needs or the specific things that you're putting it under, right? So if you're going really, really low intensity, most likely it's probably not going to help too much with your VO2 max, but it will help build the, like connective tissue, and it will help, potentially like build your cardiovascular system to some extent, especially at that low level activity. And it's not that it won't give you any benefit. It just is not, it's not as potent of benefit to your mitochondria and your VO2 max compared to the high intensity stuff. So I want to clarify that because, it's like, I don't want people to think that, oh, just because like there's definitely benefit to it, and movement is definitely beneficial. It's the same thing with, like I was saying, it's just doing more movement. Like if I had to design like a perfect, like, sort of health and wellness longevity protocol, it would be do 1 or 2 high intensity interval training, sort of days. That changes in terms of how high intensity it is, so VO2 max stuff, maybe second threshold stuff, and that changes throughout the year. Lift heavy weights, so that you're maintaining muscle mass, you potentially building muscle mass. That's going to change, like how heavy you're lifting is going to change throughout the year. And you're going to periodize that, so you could start with even like, one set of 30 reps, right? If you've never lifted before, that's still going to give you some benefit. And then you're going to move into maybe a hypertrophy phase, then a strength phase, then maximal strength, and like a power phase. And then you're just going to kind of do it again. And you're going to, continue to do that. So then you're hitting on everything all the time. And then move as much as you can, because we know that, like maybe the 10,000 steps per day isn't like the perfect optimal thing for movement, but we know the people that move more are generally healthier. And that's, probably because you have manual calorie burn. So if you accidentally overeat or like other things like that, you're not sitting in this like calorie surplus for long periods of time. And then on top of that, it's like movement is good for so many different things. Like it's good for your brain, it's good for your heart, it's good for everything. So doing that low level activity, while it may not be, kind of this like sexy stimulus to like improve your VO2 max, it's still really, really good for you. So yeah, if you can fit that in as a strength athlete, absolutely. Just, like I would say, like if you don't do any high intensity stuff, just try to do one high intensity day per week.
So like for me, I like to do a higher, interval type session once a week. And then I'll do a couple 20 to 30 minute. I know Dr. Mike kind of calls it like cardiac development type stuff. Is that just kind of layering on, like, again, is that building the cardiovascular, like I'm assuming that's building cardiovascular fitness in your cardiovascular system. It's just not, right? Like, I mean, what are
Yeah.
your thoughts on that?
Yeah, it's well, so let's also think about it this way, right? If you went and you did hypertrophy training every single day, like you did a full body split 5 days a week, by the time you got to Friday, you'd be probably pretty miserable. You'd have to reduce weights. And it most likely would actually be counterproductive to actually hypertrophy. So the same thing happens with endurance training. If you tried to do high intensity stuff every single day, eventually you're going to burn yourself out. You're going to potentially get injured. And it's just not conducive for that consistency that we were talking about. So the way that I prioritize like the development of the cardiovascular system is high intensity stuff is going to be like the biggest stress, the biggest thing that you can possibly do. That lower intensity stuff, yes, it's still going to develop your heart. It's going to stimulate, improvements in your blood. It's going to stimulate improvements in your capillarization. It's going to stimulate improvements in your mitochondria, just to a much less extent, because the stress just isn't quite as much, but it's still there. And it's still there it's keeping you consistent with your cardiovascular training. So, it's like, I'm sure you've seen like the graph where it's like, oh, if you have 1% improvement per day, you eventually get kind of that inflection point, right? So it's the same sort of thing. I just want people to think about it a little bit more from like a prioritization standpoint. Is like, if you go and do 20 or 30 minutes of cardio, like, yeah, it's probably not doing very much, but that high intensity stuff really is going to do quite a bit, especially if you don't do it right. The greater the stimulus and the more like you stand to gain more from the stuff you do the least. That's kind of like the bottom line. And if it's like a massive stress, so it's not like an either or, it's an and with a prioritization.
Yeah. So again, make sure you're hitting that top end stuff. But let me, so again, when I say 20, 30 minutes, like at least what I'm doing, it's obviously, again, I understand it's like anything that you spread out, it's like you can't sustain a VO2 max for, right? Like it's just not going to
Right.
happen.
Right.
But if you keep that relatively high in terms of intensity, does that change anything at all? Right? Like if it's like, if you're doing, let's say if I was doing zone two, like my quote unquote zone two, it's like, okay, yeah, probably not enough
Yeah.
stimulus. But if that intensity was a bit higher for that period of time,
Yeah.
is that
Yeah.
something that,
Yeah, absolutely. This is
okay,
exactly what we were talking about with like that rubber band analogy,
yeah,
right? And this is where a lot of like the older research was looking at like continuous moderate intensity exercise. It wasn't done at zone 2. It was done like closer to your second threshold, which is like what you could sustain for 30 to 60 minutes. And what they were finding is that you get good stimulus from that. So if you're doing something like that's higher than zone 2, but lower than VO2 max intensity, because obviously you can't hold it there, then yeah, absolutely. You're definitely getting benefits to that. Because if we have the rubber band again, right? VO2 max is here, second threshold is here, and zone 2 is here. If you're exercising close to what I call second threshold, which is like, that sustainable pace for 30 to 60 minutes, we pull that rubber band up, and that rubber band now, like if the rubber band represents adaptation, that's pretty close to VO2 max. So
yeah,
you're still going to get benefits to it. Right.
okay,
So it's not like an on off switch. Just know, like, again, it's like, and that's the hard thing to convey, right? Is like, it's not an on off switch. I'm never going to discourage somebody from doing cardiovascular activity, whether it's super low activity or higher, activity. I just want people to be a little bit more educated in terms of like, just know that if you are, not going at like VO2 max intensity and your sole thing is to develop VO2 max, then it's not going to be as good if you're doing the 20 to 30 minutes. And then you also have to kind of be careful, especially like from a running perspective. If you are running, if you're doing zone 3 stuff, zone 3, zone 4, like that, like higher intensity, it can be pretty wearing on you as well. So again, that's where, it's like, that's where I think like this whole, sort of notion of prioritization, do something hard, do some easier stuff, kind of comes into effect. But of course, it depends on, like you've been training for quite a long time now. It's like if you've built up the tolerance to do interval training plus, 2 or 3 days a week of like, 20 to 30 minutes at a little bit higher intensity, then, it's like, yeah, well on you. That's awesome. If anything, we could probably jump in and get like, maybe a more dedicated second interval day.
yeah.
And that might be even better for you. And then really do like 2 interval days, one of them VO2 max, one of them a little bit closer to that maximal sustainable pace, and then one of them a little bit easier. So you can, kind of develop all facets of, that like cardiovascular physiology in a sense.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I mean, it's not fun, but I do like, it is nice to kind of get that high end, close to that VO2 max, like that stuff is. It feels. I feel like it feels good, and it is a little bit more time efficient. I feel like as well too, which is nice from that perspective. Well, so when we look at VO2 max, again to bring it back to the lifter and stuff like that, and again, someone body comp focused, do you think that a lower VO2 max is going to impact somebody's ability to change their body composition, maybe lose body fat? Build muscle, things like that?
That's a really good question. I think it depends on how low it actually is. Actually, one of the benefits of having a low VO2 max is that you're probably pretty inefficient in terms of cardiovascular activity. So when you go to do some sort of cardiovascular activity, like you can do a little bit lower intensities relative, or absolutely, and you'll be burning just more calories in general. But I do think that like again, there's a spectrum. So one of the things that was identified with individuals who were, overweight or had obesity, maybe had type 2 diabetes, was that their mitochondria actually weren't functioning quite as well. So that could play into it, an ability to lose weight. But I really think it comes down to like the efficiency of how you're burning those calories then, rather than because you have a high VO2 max, you should be able to burn more and like other things. But having a higher VO2 max will allow you to do more activities at a higher exercise intensity, and a higher exercise intensity is going to burn more calories. Obviously, economy and efficiency, held equal. So yeah, I would say for most people, and I like the idea of like, it always starts with like the nutrition side of things. So make sure you're just not overeating, and then using the high intensity exercise to build that VO2 max, build your capacity to do harder things. And, a lot of the times, like when you take individuals who have a really low VO2 max through a VO2 max protocol, they're like, wow, I just have like more energy throughout the day. I feel better. Because if we think about it from like a overall exercise perspective, if your VO2 max is 100%, which is pretty close, and you have a really low VO2 max, then everything that you're doing is going to be a high percentage of that VO2 max, right? So your overall, like perceived effort is going to be a lot higher throughout the day. So just doing physical activity is going to be hard for you. Whereas if you do that, improve that VO2 max, if you like double it, increase it, 10 points, 20 points, whatever it is, the activity that you do throughout the day, the intensity stays the same, but now it's way lower in terms of how, in terms of like your absolute capacity to do it. So it makes it feel a lot easier, right? It's the same thing. If you improve your 1 rep max from, 250 pounds for a back squat to 500 pounds for a back squat, 100 pounds is going to feel a lot different comparatively. So that would be the idea, is that, you're, by increasing that cardiovascular capacity, you're really allowing for less, stress throughout the day from like a physical perspective.
Well, right. And again, if we take like a stress bucket analogy, it's like if that's everything that you do is starting to fill that up, again, you're probably going to be in a spot where your body's going to be in a tougher, it's just going to resist change probably a bit more, right? Like from a tissue standpoint, fat loss, muscle gain. If you take it from a lifter standpoint, lower VO2 max, you're probably not going to recover as well in between sessions, which is going to impact your ability to push your training as much as you want as well too.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're not doing anything to improve your cardiovascular fitness as like a lifter right now, you probably should, because if anything, at a bare minimum, it'll just make your lifting better, because you'll recover faster. You'll recover faster in between sets. So then you'll be able to lift more. If you can lift more often, then, like we know it's a load, like a load management sort of game. The more volume, the more load you have with strength and hypertrophy, the better off you're going to be. And, then what's interesting is, parallel sort of principles here. Same thing for endurance training. The more volume, the more load you do, the better off you get at cardiovascular or endurance sort of side of stuff. But just from the perspective of like, I think that a lot of people miss out on, maximizing their strength and hypertrophy by limiting, their cardiovascular development.
How would you, in terms of like where you would place it in the week, would you put it around a workout? Can you do it the same day as a weight training session, or would you have somebody kind of like try and split that up if possible?
Yeah. Generally for people, I would put it after it, and that's the general consensus, because if the goal is to improve strength, you want to do that activity first. So whatever you're trying to get better at the most, do that first. I've also worked with people though who we do the cardiovascular first and then use the strength training as a reward, because they hate the cardiovascular stuff. So then they get to go lift heavy shit afterwards.
Yeah.
So I would do that. I personally like putting high intensity stuff together on the same days, because, say for example, if you're lifting Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and you're doing a full body split, if you did like, and you're training for hypertrophy, then, chances are you're pretty high intensity Monday, Wednesday, Friday. If you're now doing, and then Tuesday and Thursday, would be for recovery. Now, if you come back to the gym on Tuesday or on Thursday, or Tuesday and Thursday, now all of a sudden you got rid of 2 of your recovery days. And now you're doing something where your body has to still try to adapt and rebuild, after doing something hard. So I'm generally inclined, and this works best for me as well, is, do the strength training. If you have time, do the cardiovascular training as well, and then keep your off days, or do something like the really easy stuff like the zone 2, or like the walking or the getting moving a little bit more, just so you can continue to have that recovery in between and not start to run into issues of, like, well, now you don't have any recovery.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that makes sense. Kind of have those days that are rest days be your rest days versus, spreading it out essentially there. So final question here, just because I know we're wrapping up on time. Any other mistakes or any other misconceptions around VO2 Max, or any mistakes you see people make, or anything like that we didn't go over?
No, I'll just reiterate, like, you don't have to jump into the deep end and do the Hickson protocol or the 4x4 or anything like that if you're just getting started, and you just do it once a week. Like you can get benefits from doing VO2 Max training once a week if you're truly doing, getting up to that intensity. Pick something that you like to do because that's going to allow for that consistency. Establish it over the course of, like 3, 4, 5 weeks. Don't change the protocol or anything like that. Like I said, start with like 1 minute on, 1 minute off times 10. If you think you started a little bit too low, that's fine. Just maintain it for the first week, and then the next week come back and do it a little bit harder. That's kind of that progressive overload sort of mindset. Once you get to a point where, every 4 to 6 weeks, if you've been kind of changing the volume, changing the rep schemes, the rest, like those sort of things, and your VO2 max isn't improving anymore, and you still want to try to improve VO2 max, you could potentially add another interval day. So you could do, like 2 days of VO2 max, and then you can get really kind of fancy with it, right? You can do like a 30-30 on like Mondays after you lift. And then on Fridays after you lift, you could do 2 minutes on, 2 minutes off or something. And you'd still be targeting, development of VO2 max. You could also start like you're doing, Jeff, with adding in a little bit more of that like higher intensity sustained work, if that's something you want to work towards as well. But at the end of the day, yeah, it comes down to just make sure it's not too low and progress it slowly, because it's really easy to, like with the high intensity stuff, it's a lot easier to do too much and hurt yourself. And then, then that consistency goes right out the window. And again, that's what I want to, kind of double down on, is the consistency is the most important thing. So if that's once a week for you to stay consistent, then start there and then build off of that.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. That's good stuff, man. Really appreciate your time. Is there anything coming out on your end or anything like that you want to let the audience know about? And then also, where can they find you as well too?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do most of my Instagram, or most of my social media stuff on Instagram now. It's at Dr. Phil Batterson. So come over there if you want, a little bit more of like the endurance optimization, sort of side of things. I talk not only about endurance, but also the recovery aspect of stuff, nutrition, fueling, sleep, because it all comes into play. Stress management as well is a huge one. Yeah. If you're looking to, maybe train for a 5K, 10K, half marathon, or, really any sort of endurance endeavor, I do offer one-on-one coaching, and I am developing a membership through school that is going to put, both coaches and endurance athletes all kind of in the same place and help them learn all of these principles that we're talking about for endurance development, which then can, translate over to strength and hypertrophy as well.
Yeah, cool. So definitely we'll have like people in there that are into strength training as well too. You don't necessarily have to be just pure endurance.
Yeah.
Too. Awesome.
Exactly. And then last thing. So I do have a podcast. I haven't, released many episodes, but I haven't released many episodes lately, but it's called the Critical Oxygen Podcast. You can find it on Spotify and on YouTube. I've had Dr. Mike T. Nelson on the show, and I've also been on his podcast a number of different times. So, if you're interested really in anything super nerdy about, like just performance optimization and physiology and stuff, head over there. And I'm sure that out of the 100 episodes or so, you'll find something that you like.
Cool, Phil. Well, really appreciate your time, man. We'll have to get you on here again. And man, we'll talk to you soon.
Awesome. Thanks, Jeff.